Hi, I'm Gabe, and I will be doing the September-October 2021 LD topic lecture on intellectual property rights and the World Trade Organization. So the resolution for September and October is that the member nations of the World Trade Organization ought to reduce intellectual property protections for medicines. The controversy of this topic revolves around whether trade secrets ought to be controlled publicly or privately in the area of medicine. Trade secrets, usually understood as things like patents or algorithms that a company owns and no other company can use, are secrets that are important in an area of trade. I know that sounds kind of circular in its explanation, but what you should understand trade secrets as are the methods that a company uses to create products, and those methods are not publicly available because if those methods were publicly available, that company feels like it would lose potential profit. So the controversy is whether the methods to produce medicines most of the time should be publicly available or privately controlled by a company. So, just starting with the actor of the resolution, it is the WTO and its member nations. What is the WTO? It is the World Trade Organization, which is an international organization that governs world trade. It was founded in 1994, which we'll talk about a little later on, but it is meant to make trade more efficient and more accessible to all nations of the world. So, before the WTO, there's not an international body that governed trade in the same way. The World Trade Organization allows for when there's disputes between two member nations of the World Trade Organization, instead of having a trade war, instead of tariffs on the other nations' goods and services, instead the point of the WTO is that there can be arbitration between those two nations in the World Trade Organization, and they can resolve their disputes without interrupting trade. So the entire point of the World Trade Organization is to make trade more efficient and to kind of strengthen the ability for companies to extract profits. There are 164 member states represented in the WTO. They represent 96% of global commerce. Almost every major commercial producer, such as every nation within the European Union and the European Union itself, as a separate member is a nation, it is a member of the WTO. China is a member of the WTO. Russia is a member of the WTO. The U.S. is. Brazil is. Every single BRICS country is. The largest countries that are not a member of the WTO are going to have very little effect on the topic. Iran is not a member of the WTO, and Algeria is not a member of the WTO. But I haven't seen evidence that makes a connection between their intellectual property protections and medicines. So one word that might matter for topicality purposes is the word the, which is why I included it as a screenshot at the bottom of the slide. So this Webster's evidence indicates the is used to reference the group as a whole. So there's some evidence that when you're referring to the WTO, it requires the entirety of the WTO and all of its member nations to change their policies around intellectual property. I don't think this is the best T argument ever. And there's for sure affirmative evidence that says the doesn't require the entirety, but it is a T argument that you should know exists. I do think it may be strategic for affirmative teams to fiat that the entire WTO and all of its member nations would change their trade policy, because there are disadvantages that say discord within the WTO, where different countries have different trade policies, would be bad for the global economy. So if all countries unilaterally changed their trade policies at the same time around intellectual protection in medicine, it might get the affirmative out of some of these disadvantages. So there are strategic reasons to use the entirety of the WTO. Intellectual property protections. So intellectual property is the trade secrets of a company used in business. Again, I kind of explained that on the first slide, but they are the methods that are used to produce products that a company can usually gain profit out of. A trade secret is the Burger King burger recipe versus the McDonald's burger recipe. Burger King feels that if that was leaked, they would lose market share and lose profit, so that is a trade secret. But patents are going to be the most important part of this topic. Patents give a monopoly on a particular product to the company that owns the patent. No one else can produce something if you own the patent to produce it. For example, the U.S. would pursue WTO arbitration if Chinese companies began to produce Pfizer vaccines. So patents are the most important form of intellectual property protection. They say that a method used to produce a product and the product itself can only be produced by the company or the individual that owns that patent. Many times inventors, like the people who invent the patents, will own the patent at the start, but they can sell it to a different company. So for example, insulin is under patent protection, and that is one of the reasons a generic insulin product cannot be produced, because it would violate intellectual property protections, because it would break the patent. So debates around the proper scope of patent law will be the center and core of this topic. So the WTO Marrakesh Agreement is also known as the TRIPS Agreement, Trade-Related Aspects of International Intellectual Property Rights. It was signed in 1994 by 123 states, is the basis of the WTO and the worldwide intellectual property regime. It requires all signatories to have minimum intellectual property protections, automatic copyright over a 20-year period. So copyright must have a 20-year minimum length of time. Copyright must have a 20-year minimum length. It also creates some exceptions for public interest patents, and it was modified by the Doha Declaration, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the main thing of the Marrakesh Agreement, it says that all signatories and members of the WTO must have intellectual property protections that give automatic copyright for the invention of a product for at least 20 years to any inventor who uses it. So, and it enshrines in law something called the Berne three-step test. Patent exceptions, so exceptions to a patent, cannot be, quote, overly broad, rob patent holders of real or potential income, or do disproportionate harm to rights holders. So when the resolution says that you have to reduce the intellectual property protections, I think you would have to reduce some of the automatic copyright protections, the length of time, or something within the Berne three-step test to be on-face topical. Many affirmatives would require a unilateral reinterpretation of the Marrakesh Agreement by a single party. For example, if you said that the U.S. should break the patent, should stop allowing for a patent on insulin, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that would require breaking the Marrakesh Agreement, which the U.S. ratified in the Uruguay Round Agreement Act. Other affirmatives would not be a unilateral reinterpretation of the Marrakesh Agreement. The entire WTO could reinterpret the Marrakesh Agreement and say it doesn't cover insulin because it's a public interest patent. But that is just something to know and will be potential disadvantage ground if affirmatives just use a single actor within it. So, the history of historical medicine IPR disputes. IPR is an acronym you should know for the topic, intellectual property rights. Many developing countries in the global south felt that TRIPS, or the Marrakesh Agreement, was overly restrictive. So, South Africa, the most famous example is that South Africa was sued by 40 drug companies in a suit that made it to the WTO for violating TRIPS. South Africa, under Nelson Mandela, created a 1997 law that allowed for the generic substitution of off-patent medicines, transparent pricing for all medicines, and the parallel importation of patented medicines. I'll explain what each of those things means. The generic substitution of off-patent medicines meant that you could create a generic version of a patented medicine and still produce it, which many felt like it violated the monopoly over the production of that product because it allowed for a company that did not hold the patent to produce a generic version of that medicine, which may have broken patent law. Transparent pricing for all medicines, it required that companies, let's say that, I'll go back to the insulin example, let's say it costs $6 to produce a dose of insulin. Companies would have to say that it only costs $6. And this was meant to crack down on what they thought was too expensive medicines, where there would be massive profit margins for medicines that were cheap to produce. Parallel importation, I will explain fully on another slide, but the basics of parallel importation is that you would buy a medicine from someone who the patent holder had not allowed to sell the medicine. So the medicine would be still produced by the patent holder, but the person you import it from would not be the person who has the license to import that medicine to your company, to your country. And South Africa felt that it would allow them to get cheaper medicines. So South Africa passes this bill. Many of the major countries within the WTO, such as the EU and the US, all tell South Africa to repeal the legislation. It causes massive negative publicity. There was this really famous scene where activists told Al Gore, who was a U.S. presidential candidate, to, quote, stop killing babies because they felt like the South African patent law allowed for better infant and mother, or decreased the infant and mother mortality rate. So by supporting the repeal of the South African patent law, it would, cause higher infant mortality. So there was a massive public backlash, and in the end, the EU and the US backed down. The companies dropped the suit, but there's still a lot of kind of latent disagreement within the WTO over how intellectual property rights should be applied to medicine. So there's this concept called compulsory licensing, which allows the usage of a patent without the consent of a patent holder. So let's say that Pfizer has a patent on one COVID vaccine. Compulsory licensing would be the government saying, we're going to not technically break the patent, but we're going to say that another company that you are forced to open the patent up, and another company can produce the Pfizer vaccine, even if you don't say that they can. It forces the patent holder to tell other people their information. So the government breaks the patent and they produce medicine. Brazil uses compulsory licensing to this day, and they use the threat of compulsory licensing to force better deals from AIDS drugs manufacturers. So Brazil is like, if you do not sell us this drug at a cheap enough rate, we will just do compulsory licensing. We will force someone else to produce the drug for us, and then you won't get any business at all. So it's a better deal for your company if you just sell us your AIDS and HIV medicine at a discounted rate. So the U.S. raised a suit against Brazil. They said that Brazil, using the threat of compulsory licensing, violated U.S. patent holders' rights. Brazil also tried to incentivize creating HIV and AIDS drugs within Brazil, so they had manufacturing capacity that was not abroad. The U.S. said that violated U.S. patent holders' rights because it gave Brazilian companies an edge over American companies. So the U.S. was mad about compulsory licensing, but also Brazil giving preferable treatment to companies that produced medicines within Brazil. In the end, the U.S. also dropped this suit against Brazil because it really is just not good PR whenever these countries are like, look, developing country in the global south, you need to stop producing cheap medicine. So there was still this disagreement over how IPR should work in the context of medicine, but none of the major developed countries had been able to force, at least publicly force, developing countries to stop using things like compulsory licensing to get cheaper deals on drugs. So the Doha Agreement and the Clinton XO were some of the major changes in IPR, in intellectual property rights related to medicine. So Bill Clinton signs an executive order in 2000 that says the U.S. Trade Representative, who represents the U.S. in matters of international trade in the WTO, when talking to other countries, etc., will support compulsory licensing for AIDS drugs in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a massive AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, and compulsory licensing was thought to increase the supply of drugs that would decrease the virulence and lethality of HIV, or decrease the virulence of HIV and the lethality of AIDS. And so the U.S. Trade Representative says, look, we can use compulsory licensing in this single instance because the crisis in sub-Saharan Africa is so massive that it requires changing our intellectual property protections. This happens in May of 2000, as I mentioned earlier. It was mostly in response to NGO pressure from groups like Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, etc., all of which felt at the time and still feel like the intellectual property regime is too restrictive and doesn't allow for equal access to medicine. So the Doha Agreement is signed in 2001 in Doha, Qatar, in response to public health concerns. The African group, which has a self-explanatory name, as a group of African countries, circulates amendments that they hope to happen to TRIPS. It would allow for parallel import of drugs, compulsory licensing, and clarifies that TRIPS would never interfere with public health. So if it was required to change the intellectual property regime so that for public health, TRIPS would always come second to the goal of public health. Parallel import is, I'll explain it here, is a process when a legally produced product is purchased through a non-licensed distributor. So let's say that, I'm just going to use the vaccine metaphor again. Let's say that Pfizer produces the Pfizer vaccine in America and they're trying to sell it to Australia. Australia could either buy it from the licensed distributor for $5 a dose or buy it from an unlicensed distributor for $4 a dose. Buying it from the unlicensed distributor would be parallel import because they're importing it parallel to the licensed distributor. The idea is that it breaks the patent because it allows for someone who is not licensed to distribute the drug by the patent holder to still distribute the drug, which is the non-licensed distributor. So in the end, there's a compromise with developed countries, which is called Paragraph 6. And Paragraph 6 states that TRIPS can be interpreted in a manner that supports public health and, quote, medicines for all. So it doesn't say that compulsory licensing, parallel importation, etc. is automatically allowed, but it says that TRIPS can be interpreted in a manner that would support public health. It also does not say that public health comes before TRIPS. It rather says that TRIPS should be used for public health. So it's kind of a compromise. One thing to know about the Doha Agreement is it's not self-executing. It requires implementation and ratification by national legislators. So the biggest usage of Doha flexibility right now is a thing called an ARVs. Antiretroviral drugs. They are used to treat HIV so it does not develop into a larger infection. And many countries in the global south use the flexibility within the Doha Agreement so that they can do compulsory licensing with ARVs. Indonesia uses it, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And changing the things that Doha didn't change will be core of the topic for the affirmative. So the subtext, like why did NSDA choose this topic at this time? Medicine, and he hasn't even talked about COVID yet. We're going to talk about COVID now. So the subtext of this topic is obviously COVID-19, which has created an amazing base of literature. Developing nations, supported by the U.S. after May of 2021, have called for a TRIPS waiver that would allow for patent waivers on COVID vaccine and medicine production. So this would just totally break the COVID vaccine patent. It would allow anyone to produce the COVID vaccine, and many feel this would allow the increased production of these drugs. Many nations, India and South Africa are the ones that are calling most explicitly for a waiver that breaks the patent on the COVID vaccine, feel that the patent on the COVID vaccine slows the import of drugs, allows for increased pricing on the drugs, all of which makes it harder for them to respond to COVID. The TRIPS waiver that these nations are calling for isn't only for the COVID vaccine, it's also for other drugs that are used to treat people who already have COVID and respond to the symptoms. So it's a little bit broader than the COVID vaccine. The reason they don't think that compulsory licensing is sufficient is because compulsory licensing is case by case. So compulsory licensing allows for countries to case by case break patents. A waiver would broadly break the patent, and many people feel the bureaucratic process of compulsory licensing and the case by case manner in which it is done is too slow and not able to respond to the changing circumstances of COVID-19. So the word medicine in the resolution, we haven't gotten to it yet. It's an interesting topicality debate. So Scott Brown, who's a coach in Southern California, he doesn't really think that medicine includes COVID vaccine affirmatives. The Cambridge the Cambridge Dictionary defines medicine as a substance, especially in the form of a liquid or a pill, that is a treatment for illness or injury. Are vaccines a treatment for an illness? I'm not exactly sure if they would count because you can't really treat something that is not already in the body. I have not had time to do in-depth topicality research on whether or not there's evidence with intent to define, intent to exclude that says vaccines are or are not medicine, but it will be an important topicality debate, especially given that the best evidence and the most recent evidence is for sure about COVID. I do think the topicality debate favors the affirmative. Just on face, I do think there's an argument that could be made that's pretty persuasive that, you are being treated for COVID by stopping it from entering the body, etc. But even if it does not include vaccines, it would include at least insulin, which is something that is used by people who have diabetes to regulate their sugar levels. It would include many HIV drugs, such as pre-exposure prophylactic, which is known as PrEP by many people, and there have been calls to break the patent on that so that less people get infected by HIV. Pre-exposure prophylactic actually stops you from being infected, or stops the spread of HIV in the first place, which is, it's a really effective medicine that is under patent. So the core policy controversy, and I think this kind of block of text that I'm going to read out is really indicative of it. Here is the basic bargain offered by patent law. Encourage the creation of useful new ideas for the long run by slowing the diffusion of useful new ideas in the short run. The second half of the bargain, the half that imposes costs on society, comes from the temporary exclusive rights or monopoly privileges that a patent holder enjoys. And this is from an author whose last name is Lindsay in an article called Why Intellectual Property and Pandemics Don't Mix. So affirmatives many times will aim to increase the diffusion of drugs, as changing patent law and intellectual property protections would open the number of manufacturers who do not require usage of the patent. They wouldn't have to pay for the patent. The intellectual property would probably be available to more people, which would increase the diffusion of these drugs, allow more people to access them. Similarly, affirmative arguments say that the monopolization of drugs allows quasi-price fixing. And price fixing is a term that is ported from antitrust law, a law that seeks to deter the creation of monopolies in trade. Price fixing is when multiple companies come together and they say, we're going to all sell, bottles of water at $2. And that way consumers cannot find a cheaper bottle of water, and they would all make money because they would all increase the price of their bottles of water. So the quasi-price fixing is that when a single company has control over a life-saving medicine, it allows them to make the medicine extremely, extremely expensive, which creates massive costs on both the healthcare system and consumers. So you could make arguments about why the healthcare system and the insurance industry are harmed by these intellectual property protections. A great example of this that you might have heard in the news is Martin Shkreli. He was a pharma executive at a place called Turing Pharmaceuticals, I think, and he bought this thing called Daraprim, which was a drug that was used for people with, I think, that had compromised immune systems. And once he bought Daraprim and his fund controlled the patent under Daraprim, he closed the distribution of Daraprim, so only a few factories could produce Daraprim, and he massively increased the price of Daraprim, all of which caused a massive public policy outcry, and is one of the arguments that people who want to change intellectual property law cite as reasons why allowing a single company to control these drugs makes it really hard for consumers to have a fair shake at buying the drugs. Patents also stop generic drugs from entering the market. What has happened with insulin is that, so a patent does not last for like 100 years, even though insulin has existed for 100 years, at least in technology. In the US, it's 20 years on minimum. But insulin manufacturers have just barely tweaked their insulin formulas for the last 80 years, which has allowed them to have a functional monopoly on the industry, and has not allowed for any generic insulin drugs to break through, because doctors think, oh, this is the most advanced insulin drug, even though it's just very different from the generic drug. So I'm going to prescribe the most advanced insulin drug, which means that generic drugs, which are much, much cheaper, 50-60% cheaper, are not able to break into the market, and are not able to kind of have the same level of efficacy as the patented insulin, because they do not have access to those tiny little tweaks. Also, affirmatives can make arguments that they either destroy or are necessary to the IP regime. So the first kind of style of arguments I was talking about above mostly concern access to medicine and cost of medicine. Patents create a monopoly on who owns and can produce the medicine. That is bad because it slows the diffusion of that medicine and means that the people who own the medicine can stop other companies from entering the market, which increases the price of the medicine. So those arguments are mostly based around the healthcare system and around human health, which are obviously really important and is really the core. But also, affirmatives can make arguments that either destroy or are necessary to the IP regime. So what I'll term as the link version of the advantage is you could say breaking patents or changing intellectual property law in medicine would break down the entirety of intellectual property law. That is good because intellectual property law deters governmental innovation, it deters development in developing countries, or what the World Trade Organization terms least developed countries, because intellectual property law means they can't have access to many technologies in many different fields. So breaking down intellectual property is good. The app does that by changing intellectual property in medicine. Or you could read the link turn version of the advantage, which I think could be very strategic. That the intellectual property regime, so the World Trade Organization and the agreements that constitute the intellectual property regime, such as Doha and TRIPS, are unsustainable and will not be followed right now because small countries need medicine. If we break the intellectual property regime in the area of medicine by doing a small tweak in some area, it would mean that developing and small countries are more likely to broadly agree with the intellectual property regime, and then you could have impacts on why the intellectual property regime are good, which include, innovation by the private sector. I'll talk about a few more of those on the core policy neg ground. But I think the link turn version about how countries will not follow the intellectual property regime right now because of medicine intellectual property rights is very good and gives you an inroad to negative offense, because most of the disadvantages rely on the claim that the intellectual property regime is sustainable and working right now. You should say it's not, and the app fixes it. So the negative ground. Issue-specific uniqueness is good. CL and patent breaking almost never happens, especially in G8, which are very wealthy countries, which include the U.S., Japan, Britain, etc. So it's very rare that we change our intellectual property law in a way that goes against the interests of big business and goes against the interests of drug manufacturers. So it's very unlikely that there are thumpers in the same way to towards negative disadvantages. The most common concern in the literature with changing intellectual property law is R&D and innovation. R&D is an acronym for research and development, and the idea is that patents create an incentive to sink massive costs into research and development because your company will reap all of the benefits. So the idea is that if the intellectual property regime works, a company produces a new life-saving drug, and their incentive to produce the new life-saving drug is they know that they're the only one who can sell that life-saving drug, so they're going to make money off of it. If the company knew that other companies could sell that life-saving drug, they wouldn't have an incentive to produce that life-saving drug in the first place, because they knew they wouldn't be sure that they could make money off of it. So that is the main claim made by most of the literature that supports the negative, that the intellectual property regime creates a profit incentive to do innovation and research and development in the field of medicine, because they think they can make money if they're the first one to produce a new and innovative medicine. Again, another way to say that quickly is that if companies believe that they won't get the benefits of the intellectual property law, they would be less likely to innovate. There's impacts on that based on why medical innovation is key to respond to a myriad of emerging threats, such as antibacterial resistant drugs, antibacterial resistant bacteria, such as it's necessary, why medical innovation is necessary to respond to diseases, cancer, etc. There's a lot of reasons why in the literature why medical innovation is necessary, both in the medical field, but also for things such as economic growth and for U.S. power projection, that we need strong industry for both of those things. And if companies innovate and produce less, we will not have the ability to grow the economy and thus project our industrial base into the rest of the world. The counterplan ground is also very good. One counterplan I think is really good is that instead of breaking the patent or instead of changing intellectual property law, the government should just buy the medicine that the affirmative thinks is important and distribute it. So that's what is currently happening with the COVID vaccine under Operation Warp Speed, which was started under Trump. So what's currently happening is that the U.S. is paying companies such as Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson to produce the COVID vaccine, and we're buying the COVID vaccine from those companies. Instead of breaking the patent, we're just buying them. I think combined with an innovation DA about why intellectual property rights are good for research and development, it would be a very good negative strategy because it tests the IP key warrant in the affirmative. Is it true that we need to change IP law so that more people have access to these medicines, or can we just increase the distribution of these medicines while having the government cover the cost, or would that solve the advantages? That's why I think that having an advantage about why the intellectual property regime broadly is good or bad would be sustainable, or would be strategic for the affirmative, because then the affirmative can say, even if people have access to medicines, it wouldn't solve our advantage about why we need to change the intellectual property regime. There's also many advantage counterplans that test the intellectual property key warrant of the affirmative. Many affirmatives will talk about healthcare costs and drug costs. If we had a single-payer healthcare regime, that might resolve that. You could respond to other determinants of health. There's, for example, when talking about things like PrEP or HIV/AIDS related drugs, there's many good articles on other ways we could fund harm reduction within fund harm reduction that would reduce the spread of HIV. So you could make a lot of arguments about why changing IP itself is not necessary, but rather changing other things that cause or exacerbate health conditions in the first place is more solvent while avoiding an innovation DA. You could also have a counterplan that, and this is kind of big brain, but you could violate other parts of the intellectual property regime and have medicine-specific disadvantages. So this only works if the affirmative has said the intellectual property regime, intellectual property harmonization is bad. You could just violate intellectual property harmonization in another industry and say, broadly, we agree intellectual property harmonization is bad, but it is good to have intellectual property law in the context of medicine, and then have disadvantages based on why medicine intellectual property is key. I think this counterplan might have some issues about whether the disadvantages you read with it would link, but I think it is good for against affirmatives that do not have specific evidence about medical intellectual property. Okay, 1 second. Okay. So, the topic isn't only Affs with plans and disadvantages to the plan, and critiques are actually extremely, extremely good on this topic and have a really in-depth literature base that many affirmatives will not be prepared to deal with. So, talking about critiques on the affirmative, the intellectual property rights regime is rooted in liberalism. And by liberalism, I do not mean like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, but liberalism in the classic sense, which is the right to property and autonomy over ideas, and kind of the idea of a democratic subject. So, critiques of this political philosophy many times are very strategic on the affirmative, because they also apply to many of the core concepts that negatives will use in frameworks such as agonism or the idea that clash produces better ideas. So the intellectual property rights regime functionally says that ideas should be the property of the inventors and they should have the proprietary rights to do with those ideas what they will. Critiques of that idea of the atomized individual subject, of economic man, all of those kind of bodies of literature that have more traditional critiques of liberalism also have critiques of the intellectual property rights regime that could be utilized as an AF without a plan, or as an AF with a plan. There are also very good critiques of how IP rights are part of a broader system of necropolitics, which is a concept from a philosopher named Membe, in which the global north controls life-saving technologies and dangles it over the global south, which functionally means the global north gets to determine when people live and when people die, because they get to determine the spread of medicine. So these critiques posit the way IP rights work is not just protecting the inventors, but rather protecting Western control and colonialism into the global South, which is many countries that are in the South and also lack the quote-unquote development as countries such as the countries in Europe, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, etc. So this claim is that intellectual property is kind of a form of colonialism in which life-saving medicines are taken and monopolized in a way that does not help people out, but rather helps kind of abstract white supremacy out. Indigenous people, there have been many very, very good critiques of the intellectual property regime because universities have tried to patent things that many indigenous groups feel like should belong to everyone. An example of this is in Hawaii. The University of Hawaii tried to patent taro, which is kind of a sacred crop for Hawaiian people, and Hawaiian people protested and said intellectual property should not apply to taro because it is life-saving and because it is part of our community. Part of our community of beings that we have a relationship to. This has also happened with corn. There have been many protests by indigenous farmers and indigenous activists against the patenting of corn technology. And I think affirmatives can make arguments, and this would be really interesting, about how corn and taro and other forms of indigenous food are actually medicines for indigenous people, and those should not be part of the intellectual property regime. I think an affirmative that critiques our understanding of medicine as only something that is literally biomedical, like something that is artificial, and instead understood many carbon-based things such as foods and our relationships with other people as medicinal, would have really good inroads on this topic and would kind of blur the boundaries between non-topical and topical. So there's also a lot of evidence coming out of queer theory about queer medicinal hacking. I would look to Paul Preciado. He talks about medicine at the intersection of gender and technology, about how medicine is a technology that can be used to change gender and also as a way to force people to kind of... medicine can be used to change gender, but also as part of a system that forces people into hegemonic gender ideals. So there would be very good topic links on the affirmative about how IP and the system of medicine broadly, where a single company gets to decide how medicine should be used in the first place, is heteronormative and is anti-queer. And the negative can make arguments about how why the affirmative seems beneficent by extending the spread of medicine. They can make critiques of the system of medicine writ large and say, even though it seems good to extend it, it's a very violent form of technology and shouldn't exist in the way the affirmative imagines. So, anti-blackness literature will also be very strong on this topic. The theft of Henrietta Lacks's cells have been used in research for many vaccines. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman who, in the 1950s, her cervical cells, I think, were stolen from her without her consent, and they are called HeLa cells, and those HeLa cells have been used to produce vaccines. They have been used to produce many medical treatments, and you can make arguments about how the kind of property and intellectual property is fundamentally stolen labor from black people. HeLa cells were used in the production of the HPV vaccine, which millions, probably billions of people have gotten. It also sets up a critique of biomedicalization, the idea that medicine is a neutral good that all people should have access to. There are many critiques of that coming out of anti-blackness literature. And the idea, which I was talking about a little bit earlier, of the body as property and medicine as property. Many Afro-pessimist critiques of liberalism and Enlightenment humanism interact very well with this claim. So on the negative, the critique ground is also very good. Many affirmatives will utilize disease and crisis representations. The idea that because COVID is so pressing, because another epidemic that will happen in 5 years is so pressing, we need to break the intellectual property rights regime right now. There's many critiques that these representations of disease create a state of emergency around disease, and those are used to justify massive violence. One example of this is how the fear of HIV allowed for Reagan and other American presidents to crack down on Haitian immigrants because they were thought of as disease vectors, or the way that Chinese people right now have faced a lot of racist violence because they're thought of by some racist people as disease vectors for COVID-19. So an author I would look into is Gwen I think it's Gwen de Archangelis. She has written a book called Bioimperialism that delves into these concepts, and I think it's really good because a lot of the affirmatives will say, well, we allow more people to access medicine, but your whole argument is the way that you allow more people to access medicine is very violent. There's also a very interesting debate in literature around biopolitics right now, and biopolitics is the politics of life. It's a concept that comes from a French philosopher called Michel Foucault, and Foucault's argument is that power is not merely repressive, where it says you can't do something, but it also creates specific forms of life that it allows. So there's a really interesting debate in biopolitical literature right now about the correct framing that we should use around disease. So Giorgio Agamben is kind of off the rails, to be completely honest, about disease right now. He rails constantly against COVID shutdowns. He rails against vaccines. He's used very anti-Semitic language too. But there's good evidence in the field right now that critiques the idea of a society that organizes itself around preventing disease. And I probably wouldn't cite Agamben, but there's probably people who cite Agamben's work and then make, critiques of it, but also say the core of it is true in this context, that say that organizing society around disease is bad. Benjamin Bratton, for the affirmative, wrote a response to this in Verso recently that I think is titled, I was reading it for this, Towards a Positive Biopolitics, I think. If you look up Benjamin Bratton Verso, it'll come up. But anyways, it says that we should care about disease and we should take public health measures to respond to disease, which will be very good affirmative evidence against many of these critiques that say that the affirmatives' discourse around disease is violent and we should not organize society around it. There will also be very good root cause arguments for critiques that deal with capitalism. The intellectual property rights regime is fundamentally a capitalist regime that is based around the idea that we should protect people's ability to produce profit, protect companies' ability to produce profit. So you can make arguments that the affirmative does not actually break down anything bad, but rather the affirmative recuperates IP. It says that intellectual property should be legitimate in some instances, it should be legitimate most of the time, and should only be illegitimate when there's a massive crisis. So there are very good arguments about why intellectual property regimes should not be understood as just, we can allow some patents to be changed in this one instance, but rather the belief that we can just change specific patents covers up the broad violence that is at the core of a system that says ideas should be owned by specific people. So I think a lot of affirmatives will make the argument that, oh no, we allow for more people to access vaccines or medicines broadly. And I think you should make arguments about why they still reproduce the system that caused that violence in the first place. And I also think I think the capitalism critique is very strong, because one of the arguments that is used is the argument that if we change intellectual property rights, it will allow for more companies to produce the same medicine, produce the same drug, which will drive down the price because there will be competition where one company undercuts the price of the other company using a generic drug, so there will be a race to the bottom as companies try to find the cheapest drug to sell to consumers. And that is, literally a belief in the market. It is literally a belief that the capitalist market will be able to solve the crisis of overpricing within medicine. And you could make critique arguments about why the affirmative solvency arguments are also invested in a capitalist mode of understanding, the market and the world. So, ethical concepts that are at play in these debates. Many articles, especially for the affirmative, are focused on the human rights violation of non-universal medical access. They make a non-consequentialist claim about the moral imperative for all countries to be able to quickly get medicines when needed. So there are utilitarian claims and consequentialist claims that say all countries should be, that say that the lack of, a strong intellectual property rights regime makes it more likely diseases will spread, it makes it more likely countries will not have the medicines required to respond to disease. And I think those are very strategic to defend, but you can also make claims about why it is a human rights violation and it is fundamentally unjust for some companies to control life-saving medicine, and we should not live in a society that is organized that way. I think soft left affirmatives will be popular, which is a term in policy debate for affirmatives that do not deal with extinction impacts, but deal with kind of more everyday structural violence impacts. A lot of these affirmatives, do not truly result in extinction if we broke. It wouldn't truly solve extinction if we broke the intellectual property rights regime for a specific medicine, but it probably would alleviate a lot of violence for specific people if we did. Similarly, there are great internal links to disease spread, health crises, and the economy for both sides in a policy throwdown. So I don't think you can't talk about extinction, you can't talk about larger magnitude impacts, but I think there's very strong internal links to smaller magnitude impacts overall. So that's my topic lecture. I hope you guys all have a great time debating this topic, great time researching this topic, and I hope this was helpful for you as a place to start your research at. Good luck!